It started like any other lazy Saturday morning. I had just brewed some coffee and was sitting near the window, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The air outside was still, the neighborhood quiet. That kind of silence that makes you feel like nothing could possibly go wrong. But all that calm shattered with a sudden, loud knock at the door. Not just one. It was 3 sharp, forceful bangs. The kind that make your heart jump a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. At first, I thought maybe it was a delivery or a neighbor needing something. I got up slowly, peeked through the peephole. That's when I saw them, 3 members of the HOA board. One of them, the president, was the same guy who'd been sending me passive-aggressive letters for months. Another one had a clipboard. The third one, well, she just looked angry for no reason. No smiles. No friendly gestures. Just cold faces, like they were there for business. Serious business. Right then, I knew this wasn't a casual visit. I hadn't done anything recently, no violations that I knew of. But something about the way they stood there, crowding my front porch like a group of detectives, made it obvious this was planned. They weren't just passing by. They had come here with purpose. I didn't open the door right away. I stood back for a moment, heart racing a little. You know that feeling when you're suddenly thrown into confrontation and you don't even know why? That. I wasn't nervous exactly, but I was on alert. These people had been targeting me for months, and now they were at my front door. Before I could decide what to do, I heard footsteps behind me. My son's bodyguard, who had come to stay with us for a few days, walked into the hallway. He was staying temporarily, helping out while my son recovered from surgery. Big guy. Calm voice. Former military. He saw my face and instantly understood something was off. "Everything all right?" he asked. I nodded toward the door. "HOA," I said simply. He didn't ask anything else. Just moved past me slowly and stood by the door. He didn't grab a weapon. He didn't puff his chest. He just stood there with a presence. You know, the kind that doesn't need to say much. That was him. Then I opened the door. The HOA president immediately launched into it. "We need to discuss a violation that's been ignored," he said, pointing to his clipboard. No greeting. No explanation. Just straight into it. I asked what violation they were referring to. He said something vague about unauthorized structure modifications. I asked him to clarify. He couldn't. He shifted the blame to community standards and repeated complaints. But I knew it was nonsense. There was no modification. Nothing had changed on my property in over a year. I asked for documentation. The woman stepped in. "This is your warning. If it isn't handled, we'll be forced to escalate." Her voice was raised now. It wasn't a discussion anymore, it was a threat. That's when the bodyguard stepped forward. Slowly. Not aggressively, just clearly letting them know he was present and paying attention. "Do you have the violation paperwork to leave with the homeowner?" he asked. Calm voice. No anger. Just a question. Direct and steady. The 3 of them froze for a second. They hadn't noticed him at first. Or maybe they thought he was just a friend. But now, face to face, they realized he wasn't just some bystander. The HOA president stammered, "We, didn't bring a printed copy. We were just hoping to resolve it quickly." The bodyguard nodded. "So no physical evidence. Just accusations?" More silence. Then, suddenly, they all started shifting. The tone changed completely. The energy deflated. What began as an intimidating visit was quickly turning into an awkward one. "I'm just here to make sure this conversation stays respectful," the bodyguard added. "We don't want any misunderstandings." That line right there, it flipped the entire moment on its head. The HOA members started stepping back, claiming they were only there for a friendly talk. The woman who had raised her voice now smiled weakly and said they'd email the details instead. They turned and walked away without another word. I shut the door and stood there for a second, listening to their footsteps fade. My hands were still steady, but my mind was racing. The HOA had been bold before, but today was different. They came thinking they could corner me in my own home. What they got instead was a reminder that intimidation only works when someone allows it. And the best part? I hadn't raised my voice once. I didn't realize how much that moment at the door would change everything. Not just for me, but for how the HOA would start behaving from then on. After they walked away, I stood there quietly, not saying much. My son's bodyguard gave me a small nod, like his job was done, and walked back into the living room like it was nothing. But for me, it wasn't nothing. It felt like a storm had passed, only instead of thunder, it was just 3 people who thought they could intimidate me into silence and left empty-handed. Later that day, I got the email they promised. It had a vaguely worded document attached, not an official violation, not even formatted like one. Just a few bullet points accusing me of creating an unsafe environment and lack of cooperation with HOA procedures. No photos. No dates. Nothing that could hold up in a meeting. I forwarded it straight to my lawyer, just in case. But I knew what this really was. This wasn't about violations. This was personal. They were mad that I didn't fall in line. That I questioned them in meetings. That I wasn't afraid to ask for proof. That I had asked for budget breakdowns, meeting minutes, and records they never wanted to share. But what they didn't count on, and what probably rattled them the most, was that I wasn't alone this time. When that bodyguard stepped forward, something shifted. It wasn't that he made threats or said anything extreme. It was just his calm presence that made them realize they were no longer the ones controlling the narrative. And word travels fast in a neighborhood. I didn't tell anyone what happened. But somehow, within 2 days, 2 different neighbors came up to me, casually, of course, and mentioned that they'd heard something went down at your place. I just smiled and said, yeah, they stopped by. That was enough. One neighbor, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself, leaned in and whispered, they did that to me last year. Same thing. Showed up unannounced. Said I had too many guests over. Made it seem like I was running a business from my house. He told me he didn't push back because he didn't want trouble. He just stopped inviting friends over and kept his head down. Another neighbor said they fined her for a lawn that had grown just a half-inch too tall right after she got back from the hospital. I started seeing a pattern. The HOA had been doing this to people for a while. Quiet visits. Veiled threats. Bogus violations. All designed to make residents feel isolated and small. It was a control tactic, and it worked until it didn't. That visit to my house. It backfired in ways they didn't expect. Because now I had eyes on them. Not just mine. My neighbors too. People were beginning to talk. Not loudly. Not in meetings. But on walks, in passing, at the mailbox. The kind of whispers that grow over time until they become something louder. And I could tell the HOA felt it. A few days after the visit, I saw the president walking his dog. Normally, he'd ignore me. But this time, he made awkward eye contact, gave a tight-lipped smile, and kept walking. That's when I knew they were nervous. Because once people stop being afraid, the ones in power start losing their grip. I wasn't planning some grand retaliation. I wasn't plotting revenge. All I did was open my door, and someone they didn't expect answered. That moment did more than any angry email or heated board meeting could have done. It cracked the image they had built, that they were untouchable, that their word was law, that they could do whatever they wanted. The bodyguard didn't even live there. He had no stake in the HOA, no opinion on the neighborhood politics. But somehow, by just standing there, he showed the board that I wasn't isolated. I wasn't easy to bully. And more importantly, I wasn't the only one paying attention anymore. What the HOA thought would be a power play had turned into their own exposure. And the ripple effect was just starting to show. A few days passed, and the neighborhood seemed to move on like nothing happened. Kids rode their bikes down the sidewalk, dogs barked behind fences, and sprinklers clicked away in perfectly timed cycles. But beneath that surface, something had changed. People weren't speaking loudly, but they were definitely watching. You could feel it in the way neighbors lingered at the mailbox a little longer, how heads turned when HOA board members walked by, or how people began comparing notes about strange fines and suspicious warnings they had all received at some point. Then came the surprise. An envelope showed up in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just my name typed in bold letters across the front. I opened it slowly, half expecting more nonsense from the HOA. Inside was a printed letter from someone in the neighborhood, anonymous, but obviously someone close by. It started with a simple line, "Thank you for standing up." They went on to say they had lived in the community for over 10 years and had watched the HOA go from a helpful organization to a group that ruled with fear. The letter mentioned how their teenage son had once been cited for public disturbance just for playing music in the garage at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. It said they had paid fine after fine, thinking it was easier to stay quiet than to fight. But after hearing about what happened at my house, they wanted to speak out too. That one letter changed how I looked at everything. It wasn't just my fight anymore. I started to realize I wasn't the only one who felt pushed around. There were plenty of others who had been treated the same way, but they'd chosen silence, not because they agreed with the HOA, but because they felt like they were alone. The next HOA meeting was coming up, and for the first time in a long time, I decided I was going to show up. Not to cause trouble, not to yell or point fingers, just to observe. To watch. To let them know I was still here. I walked into the clubhouse expecting the usual crowd, the board members sitting in front, a couple of regulars in the chairs, half the room empty. But this time, something was different. More people had come. Not a packed house, but definitely more than normal. I saw faces I'd never seen at a meeting before, some older couples, some younger parents, even a few people who usually stayed completely out of HOA business. They weren't speaking much. Just sitting. Watching. Listening. The president cleared his throat and began the meeting like usual, reading off minutes and going over landscaping updates. But his voice was tighter than usual. He stumbled a few times. You could tell he was aware that something was off. The quiet room didn't feel supportive anymore. It felt like it was waiting. Halfway through, the vice president brought up a recent incident involving a misunderstanding at a resident's home. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew what it was about. He said the board was committed to respectful communication and community unity. That's when I realized they were trying to cover their tracks, to soften what had happened, maybe even to pretend it didn't go down the way it did. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Because right then, another resident did. She stood up slowly, a woman I'd only ever seen from a distance walking her dog. She said, calmly, that it was time the HOA stopped making surprise visits and started putting things in writing. She said homeowners deserved transparency and that enough people had been mistreated under the excuse of enforcing rules. Then she sat back down. No applause, no shouting. Just silence. But it was the kind of silence that follows a truth bomb, the kind people don't know how to respond to right away. After that, the meeting moved along quickly. The board members seemed uncomfortable, like they just wanted to wrap it up and leave. As people filed out, I got a few nods. Not big gestures, but small acknowledgements that said, "We're with you." That night, I stood on my porch and looked out at the street. Same houses, same lawns, same quiet neighborhood. But now, it felt like something real had shifted. Not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt like they had no voice. And it all started because 3 people knocked on the wrong door. The next morning, something strange happened. I was sipping my coffee, looking out the window, when I noticed a golf cart cruising slowly down the street. Not just any golf cart, it was the one the HOA used for their little patrols. It's not official, of course. It's just what the president and a few others used to ride around and observe the neighborhood. But this time, they weren't just cruising by. They were moving slowly. Too slowly. Stopping in front of houses. Taking notes. Including mine. I watched them pause in front of my driveway, whispering something to each other. Then the guy with the clipboard pointed at my fence. A fence that had been approved and untouched for years. My gut told me they were fishing, looking for anything they could twist into a new violation. After a full minute of standing there, they finally rolled along, pretending like it was just another routine ride. I grabbed my phone and recorded them. Quietly. Just in case. That same afternoon, I got a notice slipped under my door. Not mailed. Not emailed. Just slid under like it was some kind of secret message. This time, they claimed my garbage cans were visible from the street, which was true, for exactly 5 minutes after the garbage truck passed. 5 minutes, and they made it into a warning. No photo. No timestamp. Just a printed letter with bold words and thin logic. I wasn't even angry at that point. I laughed. Because it was obvious now. They were reaching. They were desperate to remind me who they thought was in charge. But every move they made only exposed them more. And I wasn't the only one who saw it. Later that evening, I got a text from a neighbor, one I hadn't spoken to much before. She sent a photo of the same HOA golf cart parked across the street from her place, with a note, "Looks like they're making their rounds again. You too." Turns out, she'd also gotten a new warning. Something about her holiday lights being left up too long. The holiday? Valentine's Day. The lights. Pink string bulbs on her porch. Still tasteful. Still harmless. Then another neighbor chimed in. He'd been written up 4 overgrown bushes. His bushes weren't overgrown. I'd seen them. They were neatly trimmed, just not shaped into those odd little balls some people prefer. It was getting ridiculous. And people were starting to realize it wasn't about community care anymore. It was about control. The more the HOA pushed, the more the neighborhood started pushing back. I noticed a small group forming at the park bench near the playground in the evenings. At first, it looked like casual conversation. But the same people kept showing up. Talking quietly, looking around, comparing notes. I walked by one night, and one of them waved me over. They were organizing not to rebel, but to hold the HOA accountable. They wanted more transparency. They wanted elections. They wanted change. And for the first time, they felt like they could actually get it. Because now, nobody felt alone anymore. It was surprising, honestly, how quickly everything shifted once people realized they had each other. All it took was a few honest conversations. A few neighbors speaking up instead of shrugging off the nonsense. The HOA had relied on silence for so long. On people being too busy, too tired, too nervous to challenge them. But now, the silence was breaking. I wasn't the leader of this movement. I didn't need to be. My role had already been played when I opened my front door and didn't back down. From that point on, everything had started unfolding on its own. The more they tried to press, the more attention they brought to their own actions. They were used to people backing off after a warning. Used to homeowners apologizing for things they didn't do. Used to being feared. But not anymore. I started documenting everything. Every note, every warning, every interaction. Not because I planned to sue, but because paper trails matter when things escalate. And if there's one thing HOA boards hate, it's accountability backed up by proof. What amazed me most wasn't how petty they were, I already expected that. It was how fragile their authority became once people started asking questions. Simple questions like, where is that rule written? Or can I see the meeting notes where that was discussed? They didn't have answers. And that silence said more than any letter they ever printed. It wasn't long before the tone of the neighborhood started to change. Not just in private conversations, but in subtle public ways too. People began leaving their garbage cans out just a little longer. Someone parked their boat in the driveway for a few days, something that would have triggered an instant fine just weeks ago. But this time, nothing happened. No letters. No citations. It was like the HOA was hesitating, unsure of how much they could still get away with. Then came the newsletter. Every month, the HOA sends out a printed newsletter. Usually it's dull landscaping updates, vague reminders about rules, maybe a little blurb from the board president thanking everyone for their cooperation. But this one was different. It was defensive. The tone was off. The whole front page was a long message from the president addressing a recent increase in complaints, misunderstandings, and rumors that threaten the spirit of our community. They never mentioned me directly, but it was clear who they were talking about. They referred to confrontations at private residences, baseless accusations, and a rise in negativity on social media and in informal neighborhood groups. I could practically hear the panic in their words. They were trying to regain control not with authority, but with guilt. Hoping that neighbors would feel bad for questioning them. Hoping that the silence would return. It didn't. Because right after that newsletter hit mailboxes, a new flyer started showing up on doorsteps, one the HOA didn't send. It was simple. No logo. Just a clean layout and a clear message. Interested in change? Let's talk. At the bottom was a date, a time, and a location, the local library meeting room. That's when I knew things were getting serious. When the day came, I went to the meeting. I figured it would be a handful of folks sitting around a table, venting. Instead, I walked into a room with nearly 30 people. 30. All residents. Some I recognized, others I didn't. There was no yelling, no dramatic speeches. Just calm, steady voices sharing stories. Stories that all sounded the same: surprise visits, nitpicky citations, fines for things they didn't do or never even knew were rules. One man said he'd been fined for not trimming a tree that wasn't even on his property. A woman said she'd received 3 different warnings in 1 week, one for her mailbox paint, one for a single weed in her flowerbed, and one for her teenage daughter's parked car obstructing visibility, even though it was fully within the driveway. But what hit hardest was hearing how long people had put up with it. Years. Some had been living in fear of retaliation for so long that they'd stopped using their own yards. One couple even installed security cameras, not to protect against crime, but just to have proof if the HOA claimed they'd broken another rule. We weren't angry just for ourselves anymore. We were angry for what the HOA had turned the neighborhood into: a place where people felt like tenants, not homeowners. Where you could pay your dues and still be treated like a child in detention. The group decided to take action. Nothing wild. Nothing aggressive. Just smart, legal, democratic steps to restore balance. The first. Petitioning for a special election. According to the bylaws, which someone had finally dug up and read, the community had the right to call for a vote of no confidence in the board if a certain number of signatures were gathered. We agreed to spread the word quietly at first. No dramatic announcements, no confrontation. Just face-to-face conversations, like neighbors should have. We weren't looking for chaos. We were looking for fairness. Back at home, I kept collecting letters from the HOA, more veiled warnings, a final notice about my supposed fence violation, and even a reminder that continued non-compliance could result in legal action. I filed them all away neatly. Every page, every date. And I kept calm. Because now, I wasn't the only one standing up. The board had no idea what was coming. They thought a bodyguard answering the door was the peak of the story. But that moment only lit the fuse. What followed was a neighborhood slowly waking up, not with pitchforks, but with paperwork, patience, and people simply deciding they'd had enough. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of conversations and quiet planning. Every day, I noticed more and more neighbors coming out of their shells. People who had once kept their heads down started stopping me on the street to share their own stories. The patterns were the same: unfair fines, surprise visits, unexplained threats. But what stood out was the relief in their voices when they realized they weren't alone anymore. One afternoon, I received a call from a woman who lived 2 streets over. She sounded nervous at first but then began to speak with a steady determination. She said the HOA had recently demanded she remove a small flower garden she'd nurtured for years. According to them, it was non-compliant landscaping. When she asked for specifics, the board members gave vague answers, unable to point to any clear rules. That conversation ended with her promising to join our group meeting, and I could hear the hope in her voice. Our gatherings became a safe space, a place where we shared not just grievances but strategies. We pooled resources, shared legal advice we found online, and talked about ways to hold the HOA accountable without escalating tensions. It wasn't about war. It was about fairness and respect. One of the most powerful moments happened when an elderly couple stood up and told us how they'd been fined for a tiny crack in their sidewalk. They didn't contest the fine at first because they didn't want to stir the pot, but after hearing about our movement, they decided to speak out. Their story reminded us that this wasn't just about petty rules, it was about the way power can be abused when there's no accountability. Meanwhile, the HOA board's tone seemed to shift. Their letters became less aggressive but more desperate. Instead of warnings, there were offers to discuss concerns and improve communication. But we all knew this was damage control. They were trying to regain control, but the momentum was against them. One morning, I noticed a flyer posted on the community bulletin board, this time, from the HOA. It announced a community forum to talk about rules, expectations, and upcoming changes. It was scheduled for a weekday evening, the kind of time that usually discourages attendance. But now, with our group growing stronger, we encouraged everyone to show up. When the night arrived, the room was packed. More than 50 people squeezed into the small community hall. Board members sat nervously at the front, facing a crowd that had learned to ask hard questions. The discussion was intense but civil. Homeowners brought up vague rules, inconsistent enforcement, and the lack of transparency. The board tried to respond but stumbled under the weight of growing frustration. That night felt like a turning point. For the first time, the HOA couldn't hide behind closed doors or vague letters. They were forced to confront a community united by a desire for fairness. And the more people spoke, the more the power dynamic shifted. Back home, I reflected on everything that had happened. From the first knock on my door to now, it was clear that the presence of my son's bodyguard had been a spark, but the real fire was the neighbors coming together. We weren't just fighting one person or one group. We were reclaiming our neighborhood. I kept thinking about how easy it would have been to stay silent. To let the threats slide, to ignore the warnings, to pretend it wasn't happening. But once someone takes a stand, it creates space for others to do the same. And that's when change really begins. I still get emails and letters from the HOA, but now they're different. More formal, less threatening. Maybe they're starting to realize they can't bully a whole community. Maybe they're learning that respect and transparency are what make a neighborhood truly strong. And as I watch my son play in the yard, I'm grateful that we're part of a neighborhood where people don't just live, they stand up for each other. Because sometimes, all it takes is one door opening, and one person answering it, to start something bigger than anyone imagined. The months that followed unfolded in ways none of us had expected. The energy in the neighborhood was changing, subtle but powerful. People who once barely nodded to each other on the street were now stopping to chat, sharing updates and ideas. The sense of isolation that had kept many silent was fading, replaced by a growing feeling of community. It wasn't just about fighting the HOA anymore. It was about reclaiming our right to feel at home without fear of arbitrary rules or surprise citations. Even those who hadn't attended a single meeting started speaking up at the mailbox or in casual conversations. The stories kept flowing, each one confirming that the problems were widespread and that change was long overdue. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I found myself on a neighborhood stroll with my son. The air was warm and filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. We passed a group of neighbors gathered around a fire pit in someone's backyard, laughter echoing in the twilight. It struck me how different things felt compared to just a few months ago. At that moment, I realized the true impact of what had begun with a simple knock on my door. It wasn't just about standing up to the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. It was about reminding everyone that this neighborhood belonged to all of us, not just a few with power. And when people come together, that kind of unity is hard to break. Of course, the HOA didn't disappear. They still send letters and hold meetings, but their influence is diminished. We watch closely now, and they know it. Any attempt to overstep or intimidate is met with questions, with documentation, with a community that refuses to be silenced. The special election we petitioned for eventually happened. It wasn't a dramatic showdown, but a clear message. New board members were elected, people from the neighborhood who actually cared about fairness and communication. It felt like a fresh start. The bylaws were revisited, updated to prevent the kind of abuses we had endured. And the whole community felt a little lighter. Still, the journey wasn't easy. Change never is. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, when it seemed like the old ways might win. But those moments passed because no one wanted to give up on what we'd built together. I think about that day the HOA came to intimidate me, expecting to scare me off. Instead, they found a family prepared to stand firm. My son's bodyguard wasn't just muscle, he was a symbol of protection, a boundary no one dared cross. But more than that, the real protection came from the neighbors who chose to speak up and support each other. This neighborhood is far from perfect. There are still rules, still disagreements, still challenges. But now, there's respect born from understanding and shared experience. The fear that once hung over us like a shadow has lifted, replaced by hope. Sometimes, I catch myself smiling at how far we've come. It's not just about winning a battle with the HOA. It's about reclaiming a sense of home. A place where voices matter, where fairness guides decisions, and where people look out for each other. And it all started with a knock on the door, a moment that could have been just another quiet evening but turned into the beginning of something much bigger. Something that reminded all of us, when you stand up, others will stand with you. And together, a community can change its story. Ever since the new board took over, the neighborhood has felt like it's breathing easier. The tension that used to hang in the air has begun to lift, and with it, a fresh sense of possibility. Meetings became less about threats and more about dialogue. Instead of a handful of people pushing their own agenda, it's now a real community effort. People genuinely want to improve things, not just enforce rules. One of the biggest changes I noticed was how the HOA started inviting input from residents before making decisions. Instead of sending out letters that felt like ultimatums, they began hosting open forums where neighbors could voice concerns, suggest ideas, and ask questions. It was new territory for everyone, including the board members. Some of them admitted they hadn't realized how out of touch they'd become. It was a humbling moment but an important one. There was a sense of rebuilding trust, but that doesn't happen overnight. Some people remained skeptical, and honestly, I don't blame them. After years of feeling like decisions were made behind closed doors, many needed to see consistent change before believing it was real. That's why our group kept meeting. We weren't just watchdogs, we became bridges, encouraging neighbors to engage, reminding the board that transparency isn't optional, and keeping communication open. Our efforts didn't stop at just meetings. We organized neighborhood cleanups, block parties, and charity drives. It was a way to remind everyone what living here should feel like: a community, not a controlled zone. Slowly, the culture shifted. People began to take more pride in their yards, in their homes, and in each other. Conversations replaced complaints. What surprised me most was how the younger generation got involved. At first, I thought they'd be too busy or uninterested. But kids and teens started showing up at events, asking questions, and even helping organize some activities. Seeing them take ownership of their neighborhood was inspiring. They weren't just passive residents, they wanted to be part of shaping the future. At home, the atmosphere changed too. My son talks openly about the neighborhood now, his friends, the games they play outside, the people they know. He feels safe and included, and that means everything to me. We don't have the constant worry that a random knock on the door will bring trouble or that some new rule will ruin a day's fun. Sometimes, I think about how all of this began with something so unexpected: a knock on my door from the HOA, followed by my son's bodyguard standing firm. It was more than just a moment of protection. It was the spark that lit a fire under a community that needed to wake up. And from that spark, something stronger grew: a neighborhood united. That unity has made all the difference. It's taught me that standing up doesn't mean going it alone. It means bringing others along, sharing the burden, and finding strength in numbers. It means turning fear into action, and frustration into change. Even now, years later, I know the work isn't finished. Neighborhoods evolve, challenges come and go, and it's easy to fall back into old habits. But with the foundation we've built, I'm confident that this community can face whatever comes next together. Looking around, I see neighbors chatting on front porches, kids riding bikes without worry, and gardens blooming where once there was silence. The fight against the old HOA ways was never just about rules. It was about reclaiming a sense of belonging. A place where everyone's voice matters, and everyone's home feels safe. And that's a story worth telling. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person standing firm at the door and a community ready to stand with them to change everything.